Good morning. Good morning. Uh, my name is Greg Dotson, and I'm with the University of Oregon School of Law. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. To get us started, I'd like to introduce the Dean of the Oregon Law, who is going to make a few comments to welcome us all this morning and get things started. Please welcome Marcilynn Burke.
Good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Marcilynn Burke. I'm the Dean of the University of Oregon School of Law and the Dave Frohnmeyer Chair in Leadership in Law. And it is indeed my pleasure to welcome you here to the University of Oregon Portland campus here in our White Stag building. And we are, in case you don't know, we're one of several programs that is located here in Portland. Our business school has a program here, design, College of Communication and Journalism. So we are growing in Portland, and we're so glad to have you to be a part of that community. Today, we're happy to host this symposium, Charging Forward, the Future of Energy in Oregon. And this is a joint project, right, from our Environmental and Natural Resources Law Center and our Green Business Initiative Student Association. So those are the students that you're seeing around here. And this is the 11th annual symposium that we've been able to host as part of the Green Business Initiative. I heard a little woo on the 11th year. That's right, Emily, 11 years. And we are pleased today to be joined by several key policymakers in our state, as well as leaders in business and advocacy groups and analysts. And I just met a physicist. I'm very excited about this, that we are all here to take a very careful look at what the future of energy looks like in the state of Oregon. So today's event, before we get started, I just want to place this in a little bit of context for what's happening at the University of Oregon School of Law. We are a school on the move. We have recently moved up in our national rankings with our 3 top nationally ranked programs, including our environmental law program, which moved up in the rankings every day. So we're doing our best to not only be helpful and to be a resource for the state of Oregon, but also to make the state proud of what it has invested in. So we know that having an effective research institution is important for effective policymaking, and we hope that we're able to continue to fulfill that role. Now, I want to take a moment to thank some of our key speakers for today. We have Janine Benner, she's the director of the Oregon Department of Energy. Janine, where are you? Right there. You'll get to see all these people today. Commissioner Megan Decker of the state's Public Utility Commission. Somewhere. Kristen Sheeran, who advises Governor Kate Brown on carbon policy and energy. And Jessica Shipley, from the Regulatory Assistance Project. So these women, that just hit me. These women are going to help us explore the policies, businesses, technologies, and consumer demands that promise to change Oregon's energy future. But I just want to thank all of you for being here today and looking at this lineup today. We know that this sector has historically been dominated by men. So I'm going to pause again and note that it's a symposium beginning with women. So anyway, in the few minutes I have, I want to acknowledge a very important man in the room, and that is Senator Tim Brow. So he is the chair of our Energy Committee. Back there, give us a wave. And we wouldn't be here discussing some of these recent developments, but for his efforts. So thank you. And I also want to acknowledge someone from Representative Earl Blumenauer's office that's going to join us this morning. I don't know if she's here yet. Liv Brumfield. She's not here yet, but we're also delighted to have the support always of Representative Blumenauer. So again, I know we have a tremendous discussion ahead of us this morning. We also have another conference going on upstairs, so you'll see me pop in and out throughout the day. But again, welcome, and I understand that I'm going to turn it over to Emily Bernard to start us with our first keynote. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Dean Burke, and thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Emily Bernard. I'm one of the co-directors of the Green Business Initiative this year, and I am so thrilled to have the opportunity to welcome our first keynote speaker of the day and a Portland native, Ms. Janine Benner. Having recently been confirmed by the Senate, Janine Benner is the director of the Oregon Department of Energy. Ms. Benner has extensive federal experience in energy policy. Most recently, she held senior level positions at the U.S. Department of Energy, where she first helped manage the relationship between the department and the U.S. House of Representatives, and subsequently held a senior management position in the department's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. This office is the largest government funder of clean energy research and development in the world. Prior to her work at the U.S. Department of Energy, Ms. Benner worked on energy issues for 12 years for Portland's congressional representative, Earl Blumenauer. If everyone could please join me in welcoming Janine Benner, we would like to thank you for taking the time to be here today.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks, Emily. It's really great to be here. The future of energy the future of energy is, wow, that's a big topic. I have a really long speech. I apologize in advance if we don't have time for questions. But as a history buff, preparing for the speech, I couldn't help but look backwards. So if I were giving a speech like this 20 years ago on the future of energy, I would have outlined my presentation around a thesis that energy in Oregon is in a time of transition. So think about it. Here in Oregon, we had just passed the nation's first carbon emission standards for energy facilities. A new hybrid car called the Prius was just released in Japan. And in Texas, a new technology called hydraulic fracturing was being tested. And this would eventually upend one of the dominant themes of the time, peak oil. Enron had just acquired Portland General Electric and was promising a deregulated market utopia in California. And as global temperatures reached then record highs, Americans were being introduced to a new graph called the hockey stick. And this showed that those temperatures were unprecedented. So say our time machine doesn't go back quite that far, and instead I'm here 11 years ago addressing you at the first annual Green Business Symposium. I'm fairly certain that I would have written a speech that talked about how energy in Oregon was in a time of transition. The state had just passed one of the most aggressive renewable portfolio standards in the nation. Wind energy was being developed at a record pace in the state. At a national level, the U.S. Department of Energy had just funded a project finding that homeowners would adjust their energy use based on price signals. And as an all-new electric vehicle called the Roadster entered the U.S. market, crude oil was trading at $100 a barrel. And it peaked at almost $150 a barrel in 2008. So now it's 2018. There are no hypotheticals, no more time machines, no crystal balls. And I'm up here today really honored to be here speaking with an impressive lineup of women keynote speakers. That's pretty awesome. That says transition in itself right there. And a great number of panelists as well. And I'm here to tell you that energy in Oregon is in a time of transition. And this time I really, really mean it. It's not that those other time frames didn't involve a changing energy landscape. They did. In fact, it was those dramatic and significant changes that set us up for this moment right now, where the pace of our transition has only increased. So to put that another way, change has driven more change, leading to major shifts across the spectrum, from our energy facilities to our homes, from how entire industries are structured to how our outlets work. Some of these changes are high profile and visible, like electric vehicle chargers on street corners in small town Oregon. And some of them are more opaque to consumers, like dispatchable standby generation. So it might seem a little obvious to tell a room full of people, many of whom work in the energy sector in some way, that energy is in a time of transition. Surely you know this already. For many of you, it's your day-to-day reality. But on the other hand, imagine for a moment that we're all balanced on our respective surfboards, each one representing some facet of the energy world. And we're cruising along, we're trying not to bang into each other. But as we're riding the surf, focused on staying upright and moving safely to shore, it's really easy to miss how massive the wave we're perched on really is. The Northwest Power and Conservation Council, a regional energy planning body, used a similar analogy in a recent draft report to Congress. They said, here in the Pacific Northwest, as across the nation, a future that only a generation ago would have seemed fanciful, if not impossible. Electric vehicles, smart, internet-connected devices from phones to refrigerators, massive amounts of low-cost electricity from the wind and the sun, not only is upon us, it's washed over us like a flood. So as I prepared for today, I talked with the staff at the Oregon Department of Energy about some of the issues that we're tracking. We talked about the electrification of our transportation system, the trends towards decentralized electricity production and what that means for the system overall, the need for more investments in resiliency, and more action on greenhouse gas emissions. We talked about how in the 20th century, generation chased demand, while in the 21st century, we're increasingly flipping that model on its head as we try to move demand around to match carbon-free generation. And we talked about the role of incentives and the necessity of tying those incentives to clearly defined goals. And while we were talking about the future, in many ways we were also talking about the past, which is where I like to talk about because I'm a history buff, and about deliberate policy decisions that were made 10 or even 20 years ago. And this last point is really important. Change is exciting, change is messy, change is hard, and often going through a transition is all three at once. But no matter how we define it, change is coming. So it's incumbent upon us to have a deliberate plan to react to it, knowing full well whatever actions we take, whatever choices we make or don't make, will affect where Oregon is a decade or more down the line, maybe at the 20th annual symposium. To the daughter of a land use attorney, hi Dad. Perhaps one of the most terrifying examples of this need to be deliberate is the rise of autonomous vehicles and the sobering policy decisions that the new technology requires. So a 2016 Time magazine article summed this up really well with a headline, "Self-driving cars could help save the environment or ruin it. It depends on us." And the article was discussing a report which was commissioned by the US Department of Energy when I worked there, which found that depending on a number of factors, such as whether they're part of a shared economy or are privately owned, autonomous vehicles could reduce energy use in transportation by 90%, or they could increase it by 250%. As the article stated, self-driving cars will also have a profound effect on the environment, but whether it's for the better or for the worse will depend on technological and policy choices that have yet to be made. So as cool as autonomous vehicles might be, higher vehicle miles traveled wouldn't benefit congestion, air quality, or greenhouse gases, and they would likely negatively affect land use, alternative transportation, and ultimately quality of life. Does this mean that we should just scrap autonomous vehicle technology, pass statutes to outlaw it? No. In fact, I would have loved an autonomous vehicle on my drive up from Eugene this morning. But it does mean that the policy directives we set up to achieve the positive benefits of autonomous vehicles, such as increased safety and convenience, must be weighed with the kind of results that I want to avoid. Now, I was really pleased to learn this morning that the University of Oregon's Sustainable Cities Initiative is tackling this issue. It makes me feel a little better about where we're going to go in the future. And we're facing similar decision points across the energy sector, and a similar set of interconnected issues that don't make for easy decision making, yet don't offer the option of doing nothing. As we consider the changes around us, it's helpful to identify what's driving the transition so we can help steer it. So some of the drivers that we're watching at the Oregon Department of Energy include legislative action, maturing markets, consumer preferences, new technology and expanded consumer choices, regulatory controls, international agreements and trade, and of course, climate change. And these drivers all work together, affecting the energy landscape and informing our response to it. So I'll flesh this out a little bit through a few examples. Consider, for instance, the uncertainty facing utilities as they look into the future. So utilities, have traditionally made their money by building infrastructure to serve more and more customers using more and more energy. But according to that Power Council, the Northwest has seen less than 1% growth per year in recent years, and that's a rate similar to the rest of the country. So why is this? Well, one reason is that our energy efficiency investments are paying off. Over the past 6 years, it's estimated that we saved enough electricity in the region to avoid the need to build 4 new natural gas-fired power plants. And we'll see what happens with the rise in industries like indoor agriculture, data centers, and now cryptocurrency, whatever that is. And also the fact that our state is starting to see 2 seasonal peak demands, winter and summer, instead of just one. The Energy Information Administration's recent energy outlook for 2018 tells a similar story at the national level. While the outlook projects an increase in electricity use due to population growth, electricity use per household decreases despite the growing size of American homes. So the EIA actually predicts that by 2050, the average U.S. household will use less than half as much electricity as it did in 2017. So EIA's reasoning for this is that energy efficiency standards and technology changes mean older equipment is being replaced with newer, more efficient stock, particularly in lighting and other appliances. That's good news, right? But the EIA also includes a caveat that hits home for me. We have to make sure that the increased adoption of new electronic devices don't reverse this trend. The dual forces of consumer behavior and technologies are affecting utilities across the nation in other ways too. Last fall, the U.S. House of Representatives Energy and Commerce Committee held hearings as part of a series they called Powering America. And one of the witnesses, the president of an electric cooperative utility in Colorado, stated it well in his opening statement. He said, "The architecture of the U.S. electricity grid is rapidly changing from a centralized hub-and-spoke model to a much more distributed, decentralized, and dynamic model that offers tremendous opportunity for consumers." So we're seeing this play out in Oregon, where an increase in distributed generation is underway. Think solar panels, energy storage, and even energy efficiency or demand response. These are things that happen behind the meter. And most people turn on the light and they don't think about where their energy comes from. And if they do, it's still pretty distract, like a far-off power plant or a wind facility. But with distributed energy resources, consumers can take greater responsibility for their own energy generation and use. For example, Pacific Power is installing almost 600,000 new smart meters in homes around the state. And this will provide their customers with timely information about energy usage, while at the same time allowing Pacific Power to do more efficient management of the power grid. In the commercial sector, we've seen many examples of companies determined to walk their sustainable talk with sustainability commitments. On Monday, Apple announced it now runs on 100% green energy, and just last week, Google announced the same. Both companies are purchasing enough renewable energy to match their electricity consumption for 2017. And Oregon boasts a number of members of the EPA Green Power Partnership, including Intel, which as of January was in the number 2 spot nationwide for renewable energy purchases. Residential customers are also getting into the act in increasing numbers. So we already know that a large percentage of Oregonians support green energy through voluntary programs at their utilities. For example, for 8 years in a row, PGE has had a larger share of its customers opting into voluntary renewable power than any other energy company in the country. And in Central Oregon, customers of Central Electric Co-op can buy into a community solar project. And more Oregonians are producing their own energy. At the Oregon Department of Energy, we've issued nearly 9,000 residential solar tax credits since 2013, with year-over-year increases for 4 years in a row, and likely our biggest year yet for 2017, which we're currently processing. So the driver for this can be found in one of my favorite charts. Yes, I have a favorite chart. From a report called Revolution Now, again published by the U.S. Department of Energy. So I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you, and I know I shouldn't do that, but they're really good numbers. So this chart, and I decided not to do a PowerPoint, but if I had one, you would see cost reductions that occurred during 2008 to 2015, and they're really staggering. So rooftop solar PV costs dropped 54%, and utility scale solar came down 64%. During that same time frame, the report shows that modeled battery costs, either for energy storage or electric vehicles, came down 73%, and an incredible 94% cost reduction for LED light bulbs, and that's all in the space of 8 years. It's a pretty significant 8 years, I'll admit. So back to solar, more numbers. In 2010, rooftop solar panels produced electricity for 52 cents per kilowatt hour. In 2017, just 7 years later, that was down to 16 cents. And the goal of the U.S. Department of Energy's Sunshot program is to bring the cost down to 5 cents per kilowatt hour for rooftop solar by 2030. That's just 10% of the cost in 2010. That's incredible. For utility scale solar, the goal of 6 cents per kilowatt hour by 2020 was met 3 years early in 2017, and the new goal is 3 cents per kilowatt hour. I can assure you that that is a solid goal. I was at the U.S. Department of Energy when it happened. It took us 3 tries to get Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz to sign off on that because he wanted to make sure it was reasonable but ambitious. Roland Risser was head of the renewables program then, Roland remembers. Nice work, Roland. So the cost declines are one of the reasons why solar energy is taking off around the country. In 2016, for the first time ever, U.S. solar ranked as the #1 source of new electric generating capacity on an annual basis. Capacity additions, on an annual basis. Another way to put that, a year ago, the Oregon Department of Energy didn't have a single utility-scale solar project on our plate. But in February, we completed our first review of a utility-scale solar project, and we have another few up for review by the Siting Council this year. So all this cheap power is great, right? At the rate we're going to have free electricity in a few years. But of course, the cost of fuel isn't the only factor here, and the sun doesn't always shine. I can't actually remember the last time the sun did shine. So there's that added complication of integrating variable resources like the sun and the wind. And all of this presents a mixed bag for utilities, which must weigh the value proposition and whether it's possible for their business model to thrive within a decentralized system that uses less energy. I know Megan Decker from the Oregon Public Utility Commission is going to be here this afternoon, and she'll be diving into this question later today with her presentation, hopefully talking about the challenges associated with responding and thriving in this changing landscape while keeping energy affordable, reliable, and safe. So Bonneville is another interesting example of what happens when we're successful, and we need to adjust our institutions to deal with the success. I'm going to read to you a passage that appeared in the Northwest Energy publication Clearing Up last month, which I'm sure you all read religiously. It said, BPA faces potentially existential threats from long-term market evolutions that have driven supply up and demand down and could leave Bonneville trying to sell energy far above market rates. Now let that sink in for a minute. Those long-term market evolutions that have driven supply up and demand down were influenced by specific policies put in place by regional and state governments to do exactly that. State policies led to increased renewable energy, and actions at the federal level increased domestic natural gas production. These all drove supply up. And all those efforts I talked about earlier to do energy efficiency, that drove demand down. So these same policy choices that have delivered many benefits to Oregonians have also helped us shape a future that's increasingly challenging for utilities, which means, as policymakers, that's our new challenge, is modernizing traditional institutions and regulatory structures that have become victims of our own success. For Bonneville, whatever form that policy takes, I hope that it will enable the agency to monetize or capture the value of the flexible capacity, storage capabilities, and carbon-free electricity it provides. So now switching gears, after the region has spent decades working hard to reduce electricity demand, we're now in the process of putting policies in place that will significantly increase demand, and this is a good thing. Of course, I'm talking about electric cars and the electrification of our transportation system. Okay, who here has an electric car? Not bad. I asked that question to an audience in Utah a few months ago, and it was a little bit different of a response. So again, this is the flip side of some of the issues that I just discussed. More and more people will be fueling their cars in their garages at their electricity outlets. And this has the potential to counter the downward trend of electricity demand, while at the same time reducing system-wide energy use as we rely less on petroleum prices. Now, the United States overall has about 2 million electric vehicles on our roads right now, and this will increase as battery prices drop and the cost of electric vehicles comes down. And Oregon has just under 17,000 electric vehicles on the road. Last November, Governor Kate Brown called for 50,000 registered plug-in vehicles by 50,000 registered plug-in vehicles by 2020. Just 2 years away, so you all better get buying electric cars. And I actually think we're going to get there, in part because manufacturers, in response to a changing market and regulatory drivers, are bringing more and more electric vehicle choices to consumers. So you've all probably seen the headlines over the last year. General Motors, Volvo, and Jaguar Land Rover have all announced that they're expanding their electric vehicle fleets. And China and India are now actually openly talking about when might be the best time for them to outlaw the sale of internal combustion engines. The headlines in Oregon are a little smaller but no less exciting. TriMet, Lane County, and Josephine Community Transit are all integrating electric buses into their fleets. A few weeks ago, I met with the Emerald People's Utility District, who shared with me some of the innovative ways that EPUD is getting their customers to go electric, including a calculator that helps them determine how much they'd save by switching from an internal combustion engine to an EV. And state agencies are working together to support more public charging infrastructure on state property and new buildings along our busiest corridors, especially where we can leverage some of that money from the Electrify America VW project. And you probably all know that the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, as part of the transportation bill last session, is working on new rebates to support EV purchases and leases, including a set-aside for lower-income Oregonians. So with Oregon's mix of renewable energy, the fuel that our utilities provide to those cars has lower emissions and fewer harmful air pollutants than petroleum. And in parts of the state that are serviced by consumer-owned utilities that get the bulk of their energy from Bonneville's mix that includes Bonneville's portfolio of hydro resources, that emissions profile is actually much lower. And further, for every electric car we bring on the road, we're also potentially adding to our state's overall resiliency if that car can be used as a battery as part of the local microgrid. Since a vehicle sits around for most of the day, a charged vehicle could serve as a battery, temporarily storing energy when power prices are low and returning energy to the grid at times of increased energy demand or in times of emergencies. Now in Oregon, this is still a technology of the future, but the choices that we make today will help determine whether this is 5 years in the future or 20 years in the future. Energy storage is another example of a technology that's moving from future to present. Energy storage can be as big as the federal Columbia River power system. It can be as small as that electric charger you take for your iPhone when you go camping. It can involve technology as simple as making ice during off-peak hours and storing that ice to then cool a building when power is expensive, or as advanced as the Tesla Powerwall. Going back to my favorite chart, you see battery technology has advanced exponentially over the past few years, and lower cost mean projections in growth. The Oregon Public Utility Commission has been working with Oregon's investor-owned utilities on energy storage plans. At the Oregon Department of Energy, we partnered with the US DOE and Sandia National Labs to provide funding for a pilot storage project for eWeb in Eugene. And Governor Brown's recent executive order on energy efficiency included directives to make sure our houses and our buildings support innovations like on-site energy storage, not to mention on-site electricity production and EV charging. Now, the Tesla Powerwalls and Power Packs are notable because 5 years ago they weren't a thing. 11 years ago, the iPhone wasn't even a thing. So for all the rapidly changing developments around the energy world I just mentioned, don't forget about the technology that hasn't come to market yet or that no one has even thought of yet, and all the tangential effects that new technologies will have on consumers, industry, policy, and more. The final driver of this energy transition that I want to mention, perhaps the most important, is climate change and our increasing commitment to respond to it. More and more governments are working to internalize the cost of pollution. Carbon is already priced in much of the world, about 40 national jurisdictions in over 20 cities, states, and regions on 5 continents, representing almost 1/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions. And notwithstanding the reticence of the current administration in DC to take action on climate change, carbon emissions trading is already happening in jurisdictions representing 30% of the US economy. In 2019, all eyes will be on Oregon, on our proposed Cap and Invest program. And I'm heartened, especially after spending so many years in Washington, that the discussion on Cap and Invest in Oregon is focused on the details, not about whether this is a path Oregon should take. We're not wasting our precious time arguing with climate skeptics, nor are we resting on our laurels and on the actions that we've taken in the past to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Instead, in Oregon, we recognize the need for state energy leadership is more important than ever. By putting a price on carbon, we can reduce emissions and give our state and region the tools to prepare for the future. And thanks to a lot of hard work by dedicated people, many of whom are in this room. We're ready to take this important step on climate in the next legislative session. More immediately, I'm heartened by the legislature's recent decision to create a carbon policy office for the state to focus on policy development and stakeholder engagement, so we're ready to hit the ground running. And I know you'll be hearing about that from Kristen Sheeran later today. And I'm also encouraged by how Oregonians are taking on the issue in new and innovative ways. So 2 years ago, we committed to eliminating coal from the state's electricity mix by 2035. We're building a clean fuels market that will include credits for electric vehicle charging. We've seen the creation of the new Oregon Business Alliance for Climate. We've seen a commitment from our most populous city and our most populous county, Portland and Multnomah, to go on 100% renewables by 2035. And there's a new decarbonization study from our state's largest utility that details how they will reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Now, all of these examples were either spurred or inspired by deliberate policy choices. As I've talked about the seismic changes underway in Oregon and beyond, I've acknowledged at least some of the challenges that they bring. I hope that in articulating some of these messy, hard hurdles above, I haven't obscured the fact that this changing landscape is exciting and promising. Even better, it's an invitation to step up and continue showing the kind of leadership that Oregonians are known for. So no matter what, these changes are coming. So it's up to us to be deliberate about how to respond. That means making conscious choices about the direction we want to head as a state. You may hear people say that we shouldn't pick winners and losers. And I think that's a really simplistic way of looking at policy. You may not pick winning technologies. Technology development and the market will take the path of least resistance, whatever's cheapest. But I think we should pick winning scenarios. And for me, that's one where the environment wins, where low-income consumers win, where my kids win. And not offering up a preferred pathway, that is doing nothing, is as much a policy choice as doing something. And my vote is that we do something, or a lot of things, that keep us on the path to greenhouse gas reduction and energy efficiency. We need to be honest about these choices and the fact that the directions we take will look very different depending on the goals we're trying to meet. This doesn't mean we have to look at our future with skepticism and fear, imagining the worst. Instead, I urge you to imagine the best. We need to face our future with imagination and optimism. Change is coming one way or the other. It's our opportunity and our privilege to shape the future, but to do so from a place of confidence where we can thoughtfully consider and respond to the swirl of issues and drivers facing Oregon and the world because we know the kind of future we want to achieve. So to return to the surfing analogy, I know you're waiting for it. There's a huge wave coming towards us. And I'd argue that we shouldn't just stand here and watch it crash and hope for the best. Instead, we should ride our boards out past the breakers and take responsibility for our own success. Now, going out that far can be scary, but if we want the future to be one with a stable, healthy climate, abundant and reliable clean energy, a strong economy, and equity for all Oregonians, then we need to take the plunge. That's why conferences like this one are so important, where leaders can come together and talk about the kind of future we want to see and how we're going to get there. And if we're successful, if we can imagine the future we want and go for it, it means that the version of this speech that comes 10 years from now might very well present another energy and transition story, but one that also acknowledges that the transition was made easier and better by thoughtful decisions made by Oregon leaders in 2018. Thank you. Did I leave time for questions? Any questions? Okay. Oh, yes. Oh, okay, sorry.
Hi, Janine. I'm Susan Stratton from NEA, Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance.
Hi, Susan.
And I'm glad at the end in your wrap you talked about decreasing greenhouse gases and increasing energy efficiency. And we in the energy efficiency community would really like to see a strong emphasis on energy efficiency as a real resource and not just something we do on the side that can provide a lower investment in renewable resources, but also capacity value in reducing the overall investment that the utility can make. So I'd love you to be able to put that on your radar. It's not just energy efficiency as an energy value, but a capacity value to help increase the capacity of the utility system.
Great. definitely on the radar. We're big fans of energy efficiency at the Oregon Department of Energy, and definitely hoping that efficiency can be a big part of our climate mitigation strategy. Thank you, Susan.
Hi, Chad Marriott from Stoll Reeves. I'll be on the panel in just a minute. But so I got a question for you. What do you see politically as one of your biggest challenges or two of your biggest challenges coming into ODO after so many kind of cyclical director in, director out, director in, director out, and the legislature not quite knowing exactly what they want to do with the Oregon Department of Energy?
Thanks for the question, Chad. It's something I think about a lot. Going through Senate confirmation and going through the last legislative session, it was certainly top of mind for a number of us at the department. You know, I think the agency has come a long way in the past few years, and a lot of that can be attributed to the staff and the management there, and especially the previous director who, despite the narrative about transitions of directors, was actually there for 4 years as director, so that's a long time. And I'm really excited about the future of the department, and I think people are starting to recognize that it's not the department of 2014. A lot of changes were made in management and culture. We got rid of programs. You know, the program that caused the most trouble was our tax incentives program, and that expired at the end of last year. That causes a whole bunch of additional trouble, I recognize, for a lot of people who depended on that, and I'm hoping the state can come together and really have a conversation about incentives. But I think the future of the department is very bright. And the way that I've been thinking about it is we're the solutions agency. The solutions to climate change will be energy efficiency, renewable energy, and sustainable transportation, and that is what the Department of Energy works on.
Jeanette Whitforth, I'm also on the next panel. Thank you, Janine, that was excellent. Given the fact we have 17,000 EVs on the road and we need 50,000 by 2020, perhaps next year at the 12th annual conference we can do, or if not sooner, an EV group buy so we can get everybody in the room. But just a pitch.
Can the university do that? Yeah. Mr. Benner.
Janine, you gave a nod to land use planning, and the importance of good land use planning to saving energy, among other things. My sense is that the Oregon planning program is in a bit of a stall, and it made huge advances for a long time, and the development patterns of communities in Oregon are better than in most other places in the United States, and it is proving to be reducing transportation mileage and costs. But again, I think we're in a bit of a stall, and I wonder what the Oregon Department of Energy could do to work with the state land use agency, maybe to kickstart it again. When I was down there working, the Department of Energy was a contributor, but it wasn't working on the relationship between good land use planning and saving energy and reducing driving. So I'm wondering if that's also on your radar.
Yes. I think you might disown me if it wasn't. And perhaps you should come out of retirement. That might help the land use situation in the state. But that's a really great point, and something that I have certainly brought to the department. When we look at transportation, you know, it's not just about electric vehicles, although those are a really important piece of it. It's about the whole system. And I'm pleased that the Governor Brown's administration is starting to really think holistically about climate change and is encouraging agencies to work together and fostering the relationship between the Department of Energy and DLCD. So yes, it's on my radar screen, and looking forward to working more on it.
We have time for one more question here.
Chris Fury with Bonneville Power. More, I guess, a individual question regarding these targets for electrification of cars. I mean, several years back, I got a Honda hybrid when there was a tax credit for $3,000, which made it cheaper than the standard Honda. And so I'm just kind of curious, you know, a lot of people are rational economic actors. Sometimes they'll pay for a little bit more for green energy, like PGE, and they get a free Chinook book that sort of roughly balances things out, stuff like that. But are you looking at increasing incentives to try to reach these targets for electrification of cars in the future?
Definitely. The incentives that were put in place by the legislature are actually housed at the Department of Environmental Quality, and I'd encourage you to ask Jeanette on the next panel about those. But incentives are still an important part of our strategy as costs come down, but not necessarily quickly enough to make those cars competitive. Now, from a personal perspective, when I moved to Oregon from Washington, D.C., we had one car. We moved to Eugene. I started using that car to drive to Salem for this job, leaving my husband to take our 2 kids to school and daycare on his cargo bike in February in Eugene. So needless to say, we bought a second car pretty darn quickly. And the car that fit our needs and was the cheapest option for us of anything was a Leaf, because it's only used to drive around the city, and we plug it in at night, and we never really even question, we never have any questions about the range. So even without the incentives, I think in some specific use cases, those are becoming cost comparable. But we'll have to see what happens with incentives at the federal level, and if we can keep these state incentives. They're still important. All right. Thank you so much.